Hello again, everyone. So at this point, we've done quite a few videos since I first started doing the fairy channel on YouTube. And today, I thought that it might be helpful to sort of disambiguate the three main approaches to fairies that we find in sort of general modern English-speaking culture. So this is primarily going to be focusing on what I see particularly in America, but it does have some wider implications. Some of what I'm going to talk about I have also observed in English culture and to a degree in Irish culture. So it's a bit of a broad overview, but it is English language specific. And I do want to be clear about that because what I'm going to say, I'm going to be speaking of it in broad terms, but it, of course, won't apply universally. But what I thought would be helpful is to look at the three main approaches that I have observed or found in my study and my participation in sort of the wider community of people who study fairy folklore and of people who believe in fairies as independent individual beings. So it's a complicated topic, and I want to say from the beginning that these particular three categories are my way of approaching this. This is not, as far as I know, something that's like universally understood. It's not necessarily a shared concept. This is how I break it down myself to sort of understand it. But because we've covered so much material in the other videos, and the other videos have at different points touched on this topic and touched on some of these particular viewpoints, I thought it'd be really helpful to just do one video entirely about that and entirely discussing what those three viewpoints are in a little more detail and what differentiates them from each other and why that matters. So, as I've been studying fairy folklore over the last 20 years and, you know, in more depth and with a more academic approach over the last 10 years, and also participating in communities of people who actively in some way believe in these beings or participate in these practices, I've sort of taken to breaking down the viewpoints into a group of three. So we have what I refer to as folkloric fairy beliefs, what I refer to as New Age fairy beliefs, and what I refer to as pop culture fairy beliefs. And I want to emphasize here that I'm not placing any judgment on these categories. I'm not trying to imply that one is inherently bad or one is inherently superior. Full disclosure, my own approach is the folkloric one, so I do tend to favor that. That's my personal bias, and that's also where my perspective is coming from. That does color how I approach all this, but I do try, particularly when I'm making these videos, not to have any ingrained judgment towards other points of view or other approaches to the beliefs. This is just how I break down the categories. I find it helpful and useful. The names are just based on the sort of major descriptive characteristics. I think that this matters and that it's important to understand that we have these categories and that when we talk about fairy belief, when we talk about practical fairy beliefs, as in people who put these beliefs into practice, we are not talking about one blanket thing. There is not a homogeneous attitude towards it. We do not see agreement in a lot of cases. And some of these approaches are basically antithetical to others. So it's kind of important to understand what a person's perspective is, where they're coming from, and how they are sort of baseline understanding the concepts that are being discussed. Because each of these groups has a very different foundational understanding of what fairies are, how humans can and do interact with them, and even really a very different basis in the stories that are told about fairies. It's really not united or unified. And that perspective makes a big difference in how people approach new information and how they incorporate new stories and new material that they come across. It also is really foundational to what people's biases are going to be. I mentioned previously that my personal bias, I take that folkloric approach. So my understanding of who and what fairies are is based in that. And when I encounter information that's very contrary to the understanding that I have, that bias does kick in. Everyone has biases. Bias is just part of our nature, effectively. We tend to have these foundational beliefs that then shape our future perspective on things and our understanding of things. And when we learn something new, we understand that new information really through that filter of our own perspective and our own bias. If you're inclined to dislike something because you're biased against it, then it's difficult to overcome that. If you're inclined to like something because you have a bias in favor of it, then it's difficult to overcome that as well. So it's important to understand what anyone's bias is going into a topic. And again, this is not, well, bias itself is a judgment, but this is not me being judgmental. If I'm reading something and I know that the person who wrote it has a particular bias, I can take that into account in how I myself understand the information. I'll give you one non-fairy related example. I happen to be very nativist when it comes to Irish mythology and folklore, which means that I assume when I'm reading older mythological material and folklore, that it does reflect the actual beliefs of the people of Ireland of that time and previous generations, that it is genuinely reflecting native beliefs. There is a different school of thought called anti-nativism, which effectively says that everything we have in writing has been strongly influenced by foreign material or outside material, and that we can't take any of it as reflecting Native Irish beliefs because it has a lot of this outside material in it. One book that I particularly like, and I do recommend to people if you're interested in the subject of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the fairies and Irish gods and Irish mythology in general, is a book by Mark Williams called Ireland's Immortals. It's a very good book. It's very well researched. It has a lot of information about it, about those subjects in it, I should say. But Williams does tend to have a fairly strong, in my opinion, anti-nativist bias in his writing. Knowing that, I can sort of take what he's writing and still see the value in it, but not find myself getting upset every time he's arguing that something is sourced from classical Greek material, for example, that it's an Irish reflection of an older Greek thing that was brought in by the people recording the material, which he does in his book. Because I know what his bias is, or because I believe I know what his bias is, having read his work, I'm aware of it, and I'm aware of it as I'm reading, and I have that understanding. So it's very important to understand what people's biases are and not to just take information at the surface value. Even people who are writing, attempting to write objectively, or are writing factual material, who are citing sources, are still writing with their own inherent bias. So this actually is a pretty big deal. I know I'm overemphasizing it a lot in this video, but I think it's important for people studying fairy lore, studying fairy folklore, to really understand how perspective and bias plays into the material and plays into living beliefs, particularly in a place like the United States of America, or Canada, or pretty much any of the Americas, where we often are dealing with people who are in a mainstream culture, obviously not talking about indigenous people here, who are in a mainstream culture who did not necessarily grow up strongly holding these beliefs, but came to these beliefs at a later date, sometimes as a young adult, sometimes as an older adult. It shapes how things are understood. And when you have people who are disconnected from the beliefs until they're an adult, how they incorporate those beliefs and how they understand them can be very different. So understanding bias and perspective and understanding the different types of source material we're going to run into, the different beliefs that people have, are very important. People who come from those sort of disconnected cultures, if you will, have a very different active belief system than people who grew up in cultures with beliefs. They just do. So these are all things that have to be taken into account. And again, I'm not placing any judgment on any of this. I am just pointing out that we need to take this all into account as we're reading various things, as we're engaging with other people. You can disagree with someone's point of view. You don't have to convince them to agree with your point of view, but it is helpful to understand what their point of view is and sort of where it's coming from. That all said, hopefully we've very thoroughly covered perspective and bias and why this all matters. The first of these views that I want to talk about is the folkloric. Yes, this is my favorite. I'm making the video, so I get to choose the order, and I put it first. Speaking of bias, I use the term folkloric, even though technically speaking, all of this is folklore. All of these are folkloric viewpoints. They're just different perspectives. But I use the term folkloric for this particular view, not to try to skew your perspective or imply that this is the preferred or better view, but because the alternatives would be to call it traditional folklore or cultural folklore, and both of those concepts can be problematic in different ways. So I'm trying to avoid the problematic nuances here with referring to it as cultural folklore or traditional folklore. I'm just going to call it the folkloric view. This would be the viewpoint that bases the beliefs and the practices in the folklore of living cultures who have a contiguous belief in otherworldly beings. So this would apply to Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Iceland, off the top of my head. Really any place where you've had these beliefs recorded over a long period of time, and you also have these beliefs still alive, at least in some form today. So when we talk about folkloric in this context, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about beliefs about fairies that are coming from a culture that has had the beliefs and the practices attached to them for a very long period of time and continuously. These have been passed on. Now, there are arguments, because there's always arguments, just humans exist and they argue. There are arguments that these beliefs have been very Christianized and that shapes them, and that's entirely true. I would actually argue it's not even really an argument, it's just a true fact. However, the fact that these beliefs have existed within a Christian cosmology and a Christian framework for, potentially 1,000 years or more, doesn't actually devalue them. It just is the context that you need to understand them in. Getting back to how I started the video about context and perspective and bias. So we can understand that a lot of these living cultures that have the beliefs have incorporated those beliefs into a Christian cosmology, but that doesn't make the beliefs less valuable, or a lot of times even change the beliefs a lot. It just shifts the cosmology slightly. So folkloric material, you effectively are going to find views of fairies as mercurial beings, beings that are potentially dangerous, beings that are often everywhere around us, sometimes unseen. Sometimes they can be seen at particular times or by particular people, or if they choose to be. But the idea that they're sort of a natural feature of our reality, that they exist the way humans exist, they can choose to interact with us, they sometimes can choose to be helpful, they can also choose to be harmful, and humans have this sort of intrinsic symbiotic relationship with them. That is something we see in this type of folklore. And we find these stories dating back at least 1,000 years, 1,500 potentially, depending on when you date the Extracandla, which is the first appearance of fairies in Irish mythology. But however you want to date it, it's a significant amount of time in this belief system, and they've always sort of had this same ambivalence to them from this perspective. They can be easily angered. When they are angered, they can cause quite a bit of harm to specific humans, to communities of humans, to areas. They are powerful and not to be messed with, I guess would be the way to summarize what I'm calling a folkloric view. And that is sort of the hallmark of this view. That's the key, that's the basis to it. You can have positive interactions with these beings, but caution is needed, respect is needed, and they can potentially cause you harm. So a lot of what we find in material that comes from this viewpoint are things to protect against these beings, to appease these beings if you have angered them, and to otherwise sort of deal in a harmonious way with them as much as possible. And that's sort of my quick summary of what this viewpoint would be. The next viewpoint that we have, which is probably the second most common one, the folkloric viewpoint actually is extremely common. You find it particularly in these different living cultures. Not so much in the United States. In the United States, we're very divorced from our roots in a lot of cases, and we're very divorced from the particular cultures that these beliefs come from. And there are some issues with this sort of watered down transmission that's happened, where things have been misunderstood and changed. That's probably a whole separate video. But the next most common view that you find, and probably the most common here in the United States, is what I tend to label the New Age view. And the New Age view is sort of a melding of the understanding of fairies that we find in the Victorian era and Theosophy, which is what shifted fairies into more of the domain of children's stories and more of the domain of nature spirits, sort of started the process of infantilizing them and also defanging them, for lack of a better term, domesticating them, I guess would be another way to say it. This would be the influence of the Victorian era and Theosophy. And then we get to about, I should add that happened around the we'll say 1870 to 1900 is really sort of the crux of this period of belief. From there, we kind of move forward into the actual New Age movement, which happened in the 1970s, at least in the United States. And the New Age movement took the Victorian theosophical view of fairies and added to it, layered it in, incorporated into their belief to sort of create what we have today from this perspective. And this view tends to see fairies as intangible, in contrast to the folkloric, which were believed to be able to manifest physically. The New Age view sees fairies generally as intangible beings, sometimes literally formless, just balls of light. Tends to see them as small, which is a reflection, I should say, of the Victorian. That was one aspect that got incorporated and mainstreamed by this more New Age view. The idea of fairies as tiny or minuscule beings. Winged fairies, that's a very big thing in this particular perspective. Again, fairies with wings is a more complicated subject, but largely courtesy of the Victorians' artwork and children's books and writing. It also, in particular, shifted them and tends to see them as beings that are helpful, which is a bit of a break from the Victorian and theosophical material, where they did still retain at least a little bit of potential risk and danger. The New Age view tends to see them as spirit guides, as beings who want to help humanity be the best that it can be, that are very invested in individual humans and helping individual humans be the best they can be. This is also the viewpoint that gave us the Disney version, the modern Disney version of fairies. It gave us the Fern Gully version of fairies, little eco-warriors, very invested in the environment and protecting the world. This is all sort of the culmination and the summary of the New Age view of fairies. It's in contrast in a lot of ways to the folkloric. The folkloric view I touched on briefly, but you would see fairies as potentially tangible. You would see them usually as human-sized, often very human-like beings, just otherworldly and magical. They, as I did mention, can be malicious and are ambivalent, ambiguous, mercurial. In the New Age version, none of that. They're tiny. They are often insubstantial. They're often described or depicted either winged or as formless balls of light, and they are very helpful. They really only mean well for humans. So that's sort of the New Age view. The final view that we kind of get into is what I refer to as pop culture, or the pop lore view, pop culture folklore. The pop culture view is probably the hardest to describe in a cohesive manner, because pop culture fairy lore is really extremely diverse. It's shaped by modern fiction for the most part, and it's shaped by fiction that itself is extremely diverse. The more popular a piece of fiction is, the more likely it is to be incorporated into this viewpoint. So this is the viewpoint that people tend to have who believe in fairies, but their main source material is, let's say, Jim Butcher or Lost Girl on the Sci-Fi Channel, or, Holly Black. And popular culture, fairy lore, really is going to depend on what you're watching or who you're reading. So whereas the other two I can fairly easily quantify and describe like the basic viewpoint and understanding that those views have of fairies. The pop culture view is a little more difficult because of this diversity. If you're drawing on, one particular TV show as a source, then your beliefs are going to be in line with what that show depicts. If you're drawing on a particular author of fiction, your beliefs are going to be in line with the way that particular author describes or depicts fairies. And because there's just so much diversity in fiction right now relating to fairies, particularly urban fantasy, young adult, there's just so much out there. It's almost impossible to really solidly describe what the pop culture view would be in a general way. You'll have one series where they're fairly human-like. You'll have another series where they're small and winged. When my two older children were younger, they really liked this series called Rainbow Fairies, which is for children like 8 to 12. And those are tiny winged fairies. There's a couple popular movies that depict them that way. I mentioned Fern Gully already, but there's others out there that are very similar. And people who draw on that sort of fiction, that's going to be how they view fairies. Small and winged, and then personality is going to go with however the fiction describes them. If they're reading, say, Mercedes Lackey, then you're going to find people who believe that the fair folk, the she, have pointed ears and eyes like cat eyes, vertical slit-pupiled cat eyes, and can't drink caffeine because it's poisonous to them. Because that's how she describes her elves, her she. She uses the terms interchangeably in her work. So if that's your fiction source, that's going to be your view of fairies. That definitely is a view that many people take. I run across it pretty consistently. I have more times than I can count in folklore groups, in fairy folklore groups specifically, but folklore groups more generally, seen people referencing modern fiction authors as sources for folklore. Holly Black comes up a lot. Jim Butcher comes up a lot. And again, I'm not meaning to put any judgment on this. I will only say that what's depicted in most modern fictional folklore, if we'll call it that, is extremely at odds with both of the other viewpoints a lot of the time. And also just really needs to be understood in its context for what it is. If you want to choose to believe that is what fairies are, if that view really appeals to you, I'm not going to tell you not to, but definitely just be aware that when you're reading, an author like Laurel K. Hamilton or Mercedes Lackey or Holly Black, it's not actually folklore that they're writing about. You can certainly take the fiction, and I'm not saying not to. Just don't make the mistake of thinking that what they're writing about actually is folklore. It's fiction written for the plot and for the purposes of the plot. And I say that as someone who writes urban fantasy with fairies myself. That's how fiction works. It's extremely difficult to write fiction that's completely true to folklore and is also good and engaging fiction. There's not much out there. And I've mentioned in other videos what I do like. So like Terry Pratchett, Lords and Ladies, does a pretty good job. Peter O'Gillen's The Call would be another example. It can be done, but it's not common. Most of what's out there and is popular, in fact, is very different from living or past folklore. Now, again, I'm not meaning this as a judgment. I'm not meaning this even as a real criticism. I'm just stating objectively what the facts are. There's quite a lot of fiction that is its own unique thing, but has become really, solid folklore, if you will. And even in some cases, it inspired spirituality or religious movements. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, for example, has inspired sort of an elvish spirituality movement, which is a beautiful thing. It has a lot of depth to it. It has a lot of people who follow it. It's a very fascinating, complex system. I think the Silmarillion I really should have mentioned because a lot of it's based on that too. But so there's nothing inherently wrong with taking what was originally fiction, interpreting it as folklore, and then even interpreting that into your spirituality, just to be totally clear. But I do think that we need to always be aware of those perspectives and biases and where the source material is actually coming from. If you're reading Jim Butcher, for example, and you like his approach to things, that's fine. Just don't mistake it for older or, cultural folklore, because that tends to be where the problem comes in. So, and that's sort of how I want to segue into this. After I've hopefully established that I'm not in any way attempting to judge or criticize people who base their fairy beliefs in popular culture, because I truly don't think there's anything wrong with that, and it is its own type of folklore. However, I think there needs to be an extra level of awareness if you're going to approach perspective number 3 out of my little triad of perspectives here. Because there are some issues that pop up with pop culture fairy lore that are important, I think, for us to address. And I think if this is the approach you take, if this is where you get your inspiration or your fairy lore from, you just need to be a little extra aware of a couple things. And aware in the sense of willing to acknowledge your own bias and particularly look a little deeper into some issues. Popular culture fairy lore does have problems with cultural appropriation. I realize people hear cultural appropriation now and they groan and they roll their eyes and they stop reading or turn off the video. But this is something important that we do need to address. Particularly authors in the United States have a tendency when they're writing, and this also applies to television shows, when they're writing material, to do a minimal amount of research, find something that sounds interesting, and then incorporate it without really understanding what it is they're incorporating or how it would normally organically fit into the folklore they're looking at, and taking it and using it in ways that make it very different and sometimes even a little offensive to the original material. And, you just have to be aware of things like that. When you're reading about, something folkloric in modern fiction, and it's really emphasizing that it's cultural folklore. For example, this Unseelie and Seelie courts, which are madly popular in a lot of urban fantasy. That is an actual thing. That is an actual belief in Scottish folklore, specifically Scottish folklore. And it has layers to it and nuances to it and a lot of things that get misunderstood when the terms are just taken and used largely out of context. And the particular problem that's happened from that, which is why I term it cultural appropriation, is we then see people moving forward in their fiction with the idea of the Seelie and Unseelie court in ways that really don't work or make sense with the actual folklore, implying that it's a universal concept, that all fairies are inherently divided into these two groups. In Ireland, there is no concept of the Seelie and Unseelie. The word itself is Scots. It comes from the lowland area of Scotland, the Scots dialect or language, depending on where you fall in that argument. So to kind of take that in modern fiction and then make it a universal that applies to all fairies across the board, it's problematic at least. And I would certainly argue that it does get a little appropriative, particularly when people then turn around and apply it, reverse engineering, apply it to things that are culturally folkloric from other cultures that also don't have the Seelie Unseelie concept. Things start to get really, really awkward. And, when you then have people in the US trying to sort of dictate that this is a belief, that this applies to everything because they read it in a novel, not a good look. And I've mentioned before in a separate video, to give an example, Jim Butcher uses the Seelie and Unseelie. He calls them the summer and the winter courts. But he does also use the term Seelie and Unseelie, if I'm remembering correctly. But he uses English literary queens as the queens of those two courts. And that's really problematic. There's layers of cultural appropriation, which is one thing, but then you're also taking something from Scottish folklore and then putting English literary queens in charge of it in your work, which, given the history between England and Scotland and the politics, that was just not the best choice. And what we see happening now is people who read those books and are incorporating that into their personal folklore, perpetuating that without having any idea why that idea is problematic. I realize I'm saying the word problematic a lot right now, but it's sort of the topic at the moment. Or why people might have a problem with it or find it offensive. If it kind of is offensive, is just what it comes down to. Scottish folklore, they have their own beliefs about who would rule, particularly the Unseelie court, and it's not a Shakespearean fairy queen. So, there's that level of insensitivity, I think, sometimes to the material that's being drawn on, that you just need to be aware of and willing to confront and sort of work through if this is the approach that you prefer. There's also issues with what I would probably term pseudo-history that we run into, where, if you're writing a novel and you want to incorporate a little bit of folklore, you can make up whatever you want and you can apply whatever history you want to it because it's fiction and you're a novelist, and a lot of novelists, really don't care about folkloric accuracy. And what ends up happening then is people who are taking that as their main source material and are turning this into folklore can sometimes believe that pseudo-history or apply that pseudo-history out onto cultural folklore in living cultures. And that's also really, really problematic. You never want to be in a position where, you, particularly as someone in the United States, having read some fiction, are trying to dictate to people in, say, Ireland, what their fairy beliefs are because of what an author of a novel says, especially if they're trying to tell you that no, that's not what they believe, or that doesn't line up with their traditional folklore. That is not a good thing. And that sort of leads to this overwriting that we see happening, because we're really dealing with popular culture and mainstream culture. What ends up happening is these beliefs get big enough that they start to affect the culture that they were originally taken from in what arguably is a negative way. The original cultural beliefs get lost or get corrected by these other beliefs that come from fiction. And, that can have really strong lasting effects. At some point, I will probably do a video just about leprechauns because it's a topic that deserves to be talked about. But the short version here, for our purposes, Originally in Irish folklore, leprechauns are these sort of water sprites. They're about 18 inches tall. They can be very malicious, or helpful if they decide they like you. But they're very particular sort of fairy. And what happened is an Irish American author in the 1840s, I believe, wrote a book about fairy lore and mentioned leprechauns. And he is the first person in writing to really describe them as fairy shoemakers, as these solitary beings. The older versions were not. The ones we find in the mythology, they live in whole, towns and cities. They have a king and a queen and all this other stuff going on. But this Irish American author who was from the United States came in and sort of redefined what leprechauns were. And then that became a source for other people who were not super familiar with the folklore. And then they then wrote about it. And now here we are, a little less than 200 years later, and the view of leprechauns as these little fairy shoemakers, and if you catch them, you get 3 wishes, has become sort of ubiquitous. Even though that's not the view that we find in the oldest mythology, in the older material. It was sort of overwritten by this popular view. And, that's something we can also arguably see with the Victorian material, a lot of which initially came in through fiction, children's books, the Flower Fairies, Cicely Mary Barker, all of that, when it originally came out, was meant as entertainment. It wasn't people trying to describe fairies as they believed the fairies really were. It was just done for amusement. For the most part. And what happened is it became so popular and it became so widespread. It was accepted into folklore. It was accepted into belief. And then that sort of was retrospectively projected onto fairies in a more general sense, and ended up overwriting the cultural views in some cases, to the point that, if you ask people now, what are fairies? A lot of people will give you that Victorian image of fairies, tiny, winged, as opposed to what we've tended to find, in the majority of folklore around many different cultures for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And we're seeing that same sort of thing to a degree with the pop culture lore, where, people who are interested in the subject or researching the subject, because they're getting answers from people who are citing fiction, the fiction is then sort of accepted as the answer, which again, in and of itself, basing your beliefs on fiction is not a crime or a terrible thing. This is how things evolve and change. But if you're reading about the she and Mercedes Lackey, those are not the Irish ace she. That is not the kind of she that you'll find in actual Irish folklore. If you go to Ireland and talk to people, that is not the sort of being they're going to be talking about or describing. And we just need to be really cautious about not taking that one fiction source and saying, well, this author is saying these are Irish beings, that this is the Irish she, and therefore this is what the Irish she are. I've increasingly seen people who incorporate things from role-playing games and video games. The idea of elves having these enormously huge, long, pointed ears that extend past their heads. That's extremely new, and largely comes in, extremely new, last 30 or 40 years. But it's gained a lot of popularity in the last 10. And it comes in largely from video games and anime. But it's becoming something now that's being projected onto cultural folklore from people outside the culture. And that's sort of the key to a lot of this, is that if you're outside the culture, if your source is outside that culture, you really can't dictate those cultural beliefs. If you believe that fairies are, human-like, but they have pointed ears and cat eyes and can't drink caffeine, that's perfectly fine. Just be clear that that's a very specific, we'll say American, United Statesian view, of fairies, you know, coming from Mercedes Lackey, that's not Irish folklore. If you, you know, truly believe that fairies are, you know, tiny and winged or have these enormous long pointed ears, again, there's nothing wrong with that. Just be clear that when you're reading a story about, you know, Scottish fairy lore, if you're reading the Ballad of Tam Lin, those are not what the fairies in that story would look like. It's a completely different context, which is why I started all of this by ranting on about perspective and context and bias so much, because it really does matter. You know, me coming from this more folkloric viewpoint, I have to keep in mind when I'm talking to people who have the more pop culture view, or when I'm reading material or dealing with written material written from that more pop culture folkloric view, that is the perspective. That it's not the perspective I might inherently have. It's a different viewpoint. When I'm reading authors and people who write from the New Age viewpoint, or in a discussion with someone who that's the viewpoint they engage in, I need to be aware of that. Because if we're going to have communication, if we're going to have discussion, if we're going to understand material that we're reading, you have to understand where the other people are coming from, what their biases are, what their perspective is, because it really does make a difference. If I'm talking about being away with the fairies, if I'm talking about having an experience where I, you know, in a dream travel out and have an experience where I'm, you know, talking with fairies, from a folkloric viewpoint, I'm talking about beings that look pretty human, that are human-sized, that are just otherworldly and powerful and potentially dangerous. But if someone who's coming from that more New Age perspective is hearing me, they might be picturing me in a conversation with little tiny balls of light that are just trying to, you know, give me good advice to make my life better. And someone coming from that pop culture viewpoint, hearing me say that exact same thing, might be picturing, you know, the plot line to Laurel K. Hamilton's Meredith Gentry series, which would make my life much more interesting, to be fair. But, you know, all of this really does matter, and it matters a lot. So I made this video because, I do want to explain what my own viewpoint is, so when you're watching my videos, you understand where I'm coming from. But I also made this video as some food for thought for people to consider that there are these different perspectives out there, that people believe different perspectives, that they believe their perspective just as strongly as you believe your own, whatever that is, and that we do need to take into consideration what other people's viewpoints are, what they're based in, kind of where that perspective is coming from. I think, you know, as a wider community, the best way for us to engage in dialogue on this subject, to share experiences, to share material, is to really have this understanding and to be aware that there are these three different possible perspectives that people may have. And it does make a big difference. So that's my thought for today. This video has gone about twice as long as I expected it to, so I'm going to wrap it up now. After this, I will return to my regular video, just talking about actual folklore and not critiquing folkloric perspectives. But there you go. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section of the video. I realize I did end up picking a little bit on the pop culture fairy lore. I just think that those are points that are really important for people to consider, whether you're in that perspective or outside that perspective. Just, you know, be super aware of it. I'm sure we could probably offer a critique of all of the different perspectives if we wanted to, but that one really sort of jumps out at me because these are issues that I see pretty regularly. So if you happen to follow that popular culture fairy lore viewpoint, you know, by all means continue to follow it. I'm not telling you to change, but certainly I would suggest being willing to really dig into and consider the background of the beliefs and how you can incorporate them in the best way and the most respectful way. And to just be aware that the source is what it is, and it may not reflect the the cultural folklore, even if that's what it says that it is in the fiction. So, I promise that's my final thought. I actually am going to wrap this up now, and I will see everyone next time.